Thank you, Sandy, for the kind introduction, and thank you to Vanessa, to Benny, to Blair, the Celiac Center at Children's National. You are truly doing an incredible job to improve the quality of life of celiac patients and patients with gluten sensitivity and all of the nasty things gluten can do to you. It's an honor to be speaking in the same panel as my distinguished co-speakers, Ritu and Jocelyn, who are true eminences. I am a drug developer. I'm actually an immunologist, so I'm not a true doctor. I discover drugs and I work in the lab. I've been working in celiac for a very long time. That's why I have a lot of disclosures to make. I co-founded a company called Celimmune. Celimmune partnered with Amgen and helped us start a bigger company called Provention Bio. Before Celimmune and Provention, I was with Alba Therapeutics, and I've also co-founded a diagnostic company called Glutenostics. You're all welcome to check their booth. It's at the expo next door. We realized that patients need to avoid gluten in the first place, so that's why diagnostics makes sense, to try to help people avoid gluten. Medicines are just the last resource if gluten cannot be avoided. So the first question is, do we really need a medicine for celiac disease? Why not just avoiding gluten? Why do we need a medicine? Well, so the problem with the gluten-free diet is that it's just not an easy diet to do, and it has a high burden, social, personal burden on the patient. And yet, despite all that effort, gluten contamination is present in so many foods. It's pervasive. And we know that as little as 50 milligrams of gluten per day can cause disease activity. And that's just a little crumb of bread or any contamination. So when you look across the board, if you ask in a room with 100 celiac patients on a gluten-free diet, and in this room we probably have 200, how many of you today will have complete mucosal atrophy in your gut? So it will be 50%, half of you. And I know many of you don't know about it, but this is what the study reports say. They are all published, and it's shocking to all of us. How many of you have recurrent symptoms? Fortunately, that's less. Maybe 20-30% of patients have symptoms occasionally. This is why patients do tell us that they want a medication to prevent the symptoms and the effects of gluten contamination. This is a study published by the group at the University of Chicago, where Ritu is the head. And 87% of patients said they wanted a medicine adjunct to a gluten-free diet. That means they still want to do the diet, but if they do it, they want to be protected. It's interesting that that percentage was higher than the percentage of patients who wanted a replacement for the diet, meaning a drug that would allow them to eat normally. I think a lot of this is because patients know that medicines are not perfect and they don't feel comfortable if anybody will tell them, take this medicine, eat whatever you want. Not so clear that that will work. So we've been developing medicines for 20 years now, and unfortunately there's not a single drug on the market for celiac disease yet. Why is that? These are the phases of celiac disease. We spent a number of years working in the lab, discovering medicines. Then they go into animal testing, mice, dogs, eventually maybe even monkeys, before you can give the drug to humans. Then you need to do your phase 1. That's a small study in healthy volunteers to prove the drug is safe. Then phase 2. Phase 2A, 50, 100 patients with celiac disease to demonstrate that the drug works. Then something called phase 2B, hundreds of patients to find the optimal dose of the drug. And then finally phase 3, confirmation. at least 1,000 patients. To get one drug approved by the FDA, you need to have at least 5 drugs in phase 1, because the rate of failure of a drug in preclinical stage is 90%. And that's why it's so expensive to develop drugs. On average, to get one drug on the market requires $1.5 billion, and that takes into account the drugs that fail, that investors also want to be reimbursed for, unfortunately. So what happens in celiac disease? Well, in celiac disease, now we know we need to have a good number of drugs. Otherwise, if we don't have multiple drugs, we will never have one on the market. How do we select them? This is in 2010. We dissect the mechanism of the disease. So the disease, you know this as well as I do. Gluten gets into the gut, crosses the gut wall. It gets deamidated by this enzyme called transglutaminase. It gets modified. The antigen-presenting cells present gluten to the lymphocytes. The lymphocytes will destroy epithelial cells of the gut, and they will also produce antibodies that we can measure as a diagnostic of the disease, the anti-transglutaminase antibodies. The other action of gluten is it directly stimulates these cells called IELs, intraepithelial lymphocytes, which are present in the gut. The IELs directly activate the lymphocytes and also destroy the epithelial cells of the gut. So now that we understand the disease, we have a logical way to design drugs. First, Alvine was the first company started by Chetan Khosla in California. They had a drug that digests gluten, chops gluten, makes it into smaller fragments. Alba, the company where I worked, I was chief medical officer there. We had a drug to prevent the entry of gluten into the gut. Chemocentrics prevent the activation of the lymphocytes, and then Immucin T, trying to desensitize the lymphocytes, induce tolerance against gluten. So that was in 2010. All of these companies have failed. None of these companies still exists. That tells you how hard it is to develop drugs in celiac disease. The good news is people have kept persevering, and today, in 2019, we have many, many more companies, many more drugs that are being tested. In blue, you have drugs that are in animal studies, and in green, you have drugs that are in human studies. And all the slides are available to you, so you can take a look at this later if you want. So let's spend a few minutes here. So first, what can we do with gluten? Can we modify gluten in food so that it is less stimulating of the immune system? There are several universities are developing gluten that has less potential to activate the immune system. The problem with this is that you could never guarantee you're not getting contaminated. You can eat this gluten, you can eat food made with this gluten, but what about contamination? So you're still left with the same problem. So how about the original idea of digesting gluten with glutenases? The Alvine drug was acquired by Immunogenics, and Immunogenics is now persevering. They went back to the drawing board, and now they are conducting a phase 2A study sponsored by the NIH, and they are trying to develop latiglutenase so that you could drink a solution of this drug before meals, and it will protect you for 30 minutes. It will digest the gluten in your stomach. This could be an interesting approach, but it will always require you to have this drink. It will only last for 30 minutes. So there are some limitations as well, but a very interesting approach. And other companies like PVP Biologics developing a more potent version of the Immunogenics drug. The second approach is, can we prevent gluten from getting into the gut? The Alba drug, larasotide, is now under development by Innovate. Innovate is a public company now in phase 3. They are trying to prevent gluten from getting into the gut. They have some data with symptoms, and they are actually the first company that made it through phase 3 in celiac disease, so we await news from this medication. Once gluten is inside the gut, it will get modified by the TTG. There are several companies like Celiac, which was also started by a very prominent celiac scientist, Dr. Schupan in Germany. This molecule prevents the modification of gluten and improves celiac disease. They are in phase 2A. On the other side, this is for modification of gluten. On the other side, on the side of T cell activation, Takeda has become the leading company in celiac. As you know, it's a very big pharmaceutical company, and they have a drug called Entyvio that prevents activated lymphocytes from getting into the gut. There are several approaches, but as you can see, they're all blue here. Most of them are blue, to try to tolerize the immune system against gluten. These approaches are very modern, nanoparticles and different technologies that make the immune system not react against gluten. And here is where Immusan T was until a few weeks ago. Immusan T was the leading company for this type of therapies, but unfortunately, as you may have read, the so-called vaccine didn't work in phase 2A. I say it's so-called vaccine because it's not a vaccine you will take when you are a baby to prevent you from developing celiac. It's a vaccine that you take once you have celiac to induce desensitization so that you don't react against gluten. But unfortunately, it didn't work. And then finally, there are a number of companies trying to act on the IELs, the intraepithelial lymphocytes, and the main mediator that activates the intraepithelial lymphocytes. It's called interleukin-15, IL-15. IL-15 is a molecule produced by the epithelial cells of the gut that activates the IELs. My company, Provention Bio, and a few other companies, Calypso, Bionis, they all have approaches to try to prevent interleukin-15 activation. So now I'm going to switch gears in the final minutes of my talk and tell you a little bit about what Provention is doing to try to help celiac patients. Provention decided to look a little earlier in the disease process. In all autoimmune diseases, you have a genetic risk. There is always an infection that triggers the autoimmune disease. You recognize the autoimmunity has started because you have the autoantibodies. In the case of celiac, transglutaminase antibodies. At some point, there is tissue damage, in this case in the gut, and that will lead to chronic disease symptoms. So most of pharmaceutical companies try to prevent the symptoms, try to work in the late stage of the disease. At Provention, we said, why don't we try to prevent disease, act on the triggers? Why don't we try to intercept the disease early? So we have a pipeline with 5 drugs. Our most advanced product actually is in diabetes, and that's because Provention's initial funding came from T1D patients with type 1 diabetes. They made an initial investment in Provention, and that investment led us to develop teplizumab. It's an antibody that now has been shown to delay and prevent the onset of T1D. So for children who have antibodies but no disease, you can give them this drug and they will not develop disease for at least 2 years after a single course of this drug. This is now granted breakthrough designation by the FDA, and we are going to file for approval next year. So this could be the first drug for type 1 diabetes since insulin, since 100 years. We believe that teplizumab could also be applied to celiac disease, and we plan on studying that in the future. For celiac, we have 2 programs specifically. The anti-interleukin-15 antibody, PRV-015, which is designed to prevent the effects of gluten contamination in patients who have gluten-free diet, non-responsive celiac disease. As you know, this is a bit of it's a term that doesn't really reflect the reality. Gluten-free diet, non-responding means contamination. It doesn't mean if you were able to do the diet 100% you wouldn't respond. The problem is you can't maintain 100% gluten-free permanently. So we're in phase 2B, and we're partnered with Amgen. And finally, we have a vaccine. This is a true vaccine for babies to prevent the initial infection, which appears to be linked to type 1 diabetes and a subset of celiac. It's a virus called Coxsackie B virus. We're developing the first vaccine against Coxsackie B. We are in final preclinical stage, and we'll start clinical trials next year. I'm going to just wrap up showing you very quickly the results of the phase 2A study with PRV-015, the anti-interleukin-15 antibody. They were presented at Digestive Disease Week and ICDS, the main celiac conferences. In this trial, we actually had 2 patient groups. I want to show this to you because it's very interesting. We had a group of patients who were completely gluten-free, and we gave them a gluten challenge. And we measured gluten in their stool and their urine with a test that our friends at Glutenostics are demonstrating at the booth. And this is Tony Garamond, the CEO of Glutenostics, who is at the booth with his wife, Susan. These tests allow you to test your urine and your stool to understand if you had gluten contamination. So we use those tests first to confirm the gluten challenge. And indeed, when we gave the gluten challenge, 100% of patients had taken the gluten challenge at the beginning of the study, but by the time we got to the end, people were actually hiding it or throwing it, flushing it through in the toilet. They were not taking the challenge anymore, and you can't blame them for that. But the most interesting thing is we had a second group of patients who did not receive gluten challenge, and they were supposed to be gluten-free. But as you can see here, they had contamination before the study, and they had contamination during the study. So this is the problem, is that even when you're gluten-free, you're being monitored, you're in a trial. You can't avoid gluten completely, at least 30% of the patients, which is consistent with the literature. So what happened with the drug? The drug was able to reduce inflammation, and these are just the intraepithelial lymphocytes. We counted them, and there was a reduction, but you can see it's not a complete reduction. So this drug cannot allow patients to eat normally. It doesn't give full protection. It's just a reduction in inflammation. What it did very well was to reduce the symptoms. This is a group in black is the placebo group. They have increase in symptoms. And in the active groups, there is a reduction as measured by 3 different measures. This is the BSFS, when you assess the consistency and the shape of your stools. And the placebo group, there is increase in diarrhea. In the active groups, there is a clear decrease in diarrhea. The physicians rated patients who had taken the drug as not having disease activity, which was very interesting. So we published this work in The Lancet, which is a very good journal. In terms of safety, we didn't have serious adverse events, but there was injection site reaction. This is an injectable medication. In the future, patients will be able to self-administer at home a single injection once a month, and that will protect you from contamination if things work as we expect. But at the site of the injection, it's like an insulin injection, small injection. There was a bit of reactivity, which disappeared after a few hours. So just redness, a little itchiness that disappeared. Because of these good results, Amgen has sponsored, they made an investment in Provention, and we're now conducting a phase 2B trial, which will start enrolling patients in June next year. We will go to many hospitals in the United States, and we hope to see some of you volunteering for this study. It's a 220 patient trial, and it will last 6 months. There's no gluten challenge, so we will just take patients who have recurrent symptoms. We will dose active or placebo, the drug or placebo, and we will assess if the drug can prevent the contamination, the effects of contamination. And this is my last slide. I just need to really thank anybody who has ever volunteered for a clinical study, because without the 3,000 patients, heroes, who have participated in trials of medications for celiac disease, we wouldn't be where we are today with this broad pipeline that now almost guarantees there is going to be finally a drug for celiac in the next 5+ years, because now we know we have so many drugs in phase 2, starting to trickle into phase 2b, phase 3. So finally there will be additional solutions. And is the first drug going to be a miracle drug? By no means. But once there is one drug on the market, that attracts investment, that attracts the attention of the medical community as well, the physicians and the FDA. So it will be a very important tipping point to provide you with more solutions so that you can do a better diet, better diagnostics, and for those of you who still, despite the diet, you still remain active, you could take a medication. So thank you very much to all of you and all the celiac patients who volunteer for clinical trials. Thank you.